Okay, this is the audio for Systems of Power and Inequality from Race, Class, and Gender. Okay, so what does it mean that race, class, and gender are intersectional systems of inequality? So really, finding out the answer to that is by looking at how race, class, and gender operate. So they are systemic forms of inequality. They're built into the structure of society. And so this affects even our analysis of those identities and of those structures. So we have to analyze them as social structures in order to think about how race, class, gender, and all these other identities that we talk about, how they operate, what it means, how those meanings change depending on the kind of social context, right? And how those meanings influence and affect people's lives. So when you use a social structural analysis and analyze the systems of race, class, and gender, you can see how they work as a system of power that gives some power and access to some groups while limiting or denying it to others based on their social location. So again, the social location is just where an individual falls in the social hierarchies based on their own social identities and how they're structured in the social hierarchy. So again, if you just look at race, class, and gender, where you are on each one of those hierarchies, if you add all those hierarchies together, that's your social location, right? And another kind of way to understand this is through the matrix of domination, which stresses that none of these factors operate alone. Meaning race, you're not your race one day and your class the next day, right? Your race, your class, your gender, your sexuality, all of these things overlap and interact to form a complex social relationship. So basically, we don't experience these things separately. We experience them as overlapping, meaning they come to define things in interrelated ways. So we can't really dissect them completely. Oftentimes, it can be difficult to parse out which identity is the reason that you're getting prejudice, right? So if you are a queer woman of color who's disabled, right, and in poverty, it becomes a lot more difficult to kind of cross the lines of, okay, which identity is this person having a problem with? It's often the combination of identities or the complex kind of sum of our identities that affect the way that we're actually seen in the world, the way we're treated, and what opportunities we have. So social structure is an important part of the analysis, right? Because inequality has been baked into the social institutions and the values, built into these institutions brick by brick. So we come to see the people in power as normal and natural, and the people at the bottom of the hierarchy as largely at fault for being in the low social position. This is the way that the social structure kind of reinforces itself by creating these ideologies that support power in the way that they currently operate, right? Oftentimes we call this the status quo, right? So again, when it comes to analyzing these things from a social structural perspective, you have to really look at how each of these categories, whether it's race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, any of these kind of categories, is socially constructed. So that means the significance of those categories are determined by the culture, right? So the significance of race is determined by the culture. The significance of class, of gender, of sexuality, of all of these different things are determined by the culture and the historical processes of that culture that kind of built that ideology. So they also tend to be binaries, as we've discussed before. We love constructing otherness, right? Saying that one thing is normal and something is now the opposite, right? The binary, right? One is an accepted category, one is marginalized. So dichotomies we love, like man, woman, black, white, rich, poor, gay, straight, right? Even something like citizen, alien. But none of these things are really that cut and dry. These binaries are much more complex in actual reality, and this is why it complicates those senses of identities that we have, because we learn identities based on these false binaries. So once you kind of pull the wool off of someone's eyes and show them that there are more complex identities, that can often upset people, scare them, right? Because it shakes up their whole notion of how society functions or should or is, when in reality, these are things that are just constructed for us, right? Kind of a mild social control, right? To get us to kind of think in a way that prioritizes the people that have the power, that are at the top of the hierarchies. So also, each is a category of individual and group identity, but they're also social structures. They're not just about our identities, right? They're about group location in a system of power and inequality, right? They shape patterns in social institutions like the labor market we'll talk about later, roles in the family, expectations in the family, types of families, right? The government, right? Laws, how they're constructed, how they're enforced, right? And of course, the media. Those depictions, those portrayals have a lot to do with kind of conveying our value systems. That's why so much of this white supremacist thinking that's in the culture makes its way into the media and is so readily seen in these kind of white savior narratives. Okay, so neither race, class, or gender is a fixed category. They're social constructions, so they're not static. Their form and interrelationships change over time. This is how social change is possible, right? Things change over time. So race, class, and gender divisions are deeply embedded in the structure of social institutions. They shape human relationships, identities, and really the social institutions give us roles and values that affect us from the macro to the micro. So when we look at race, class, and gender divisions, we see the social issues emerge from different institutions. So within work, who gets what positions within a career field? What fields are most dominated by which groups? And what pay and status a job has is often very clearly related to race, class, and gender. Again, in the family, what roles are we expecting? Right? So often gender has a lot to do with those kind of status and roles in the family. Also, race, class, and gender affect how families experience different issues. And really their values and access has a lot to do with these factors. Within education, because education is stratified by social class, we don't offer free public universities. And so also the structure of K through 12 education is related to class because of property tax values structuring school funding. So you see that education, while it's often lauded as a path out of poverty, is also reifying poverty and social inequality because of the structure of the system itself, right? So also we learn about who is valuable in the society, and we only learn that that's white European men, right? When we have women and people of color written out of history books, when we have the poor marginalized as just laborers, and we only kind of focus on the barons or the Jeff Bezoses of their time, right? We really miss the complex nature of people's individual contributions to, this American society. So obviously the politics of the classroom is also affected by social class, race, and gender, right? What students are seen as disruptive, which students are seen as, in need of more help, kind of things like this, remedial. A lot of that has to do with those prejudices that we already have that we then put on children. So again, we could look at so many different institutions, the state itself, right? The criminal justice system, all sorts of systems, and see how race, class, and gender have these kind of deep divisions arise when you're examining those issues within those systems. So we see how it's a complex nature between the identities and the institutions that somewhat reinforce them. And oftentimes, these things do change and adapt over time because, again, they're not static. They're always evolving. So when it comes to race and racism, prejudice is a hostile attitude towards a person who is presumed to have negative characteristics associated with a group to which they belong. Long-winded way of saying, you look at a person, you think they're associated with a particular group, and you judge them based on that, right? So you see someone, you assume that they're female, therefore you assume any of the negative stereotypes you have about women onto that person, right? So prejudice is something that it's basically a thought process, right? Versus, discrimination, racism, these are more actions, the actions of prejudice, right? So we talk about dealing with prejudice, dealing with prejudicial thinking, because of course that is the root of a lot of these issues of discrimination. But as we'll discuss, when it comes to systematic discrimination, systematic racism, those things are difficult to unpack because it goes beyond individual prejudice and goes into how the structure of the systems themselves cause or at least preserve inequalities, right? All right, moving on to racism. This is more systematic than prejudice. So prejudice refers to people's attitudes. Racism is a system of power and privilege that can be a part of people's opinions, but it's also rooted in society's social structure, right? So this is why when people get all, oh, reverse racism, yeah, that's not a thing, right? You can be discriminated against because you're basically a minority in a space, meaning you're a person that has the less either numbers or power within a space, right? But it's not racism to have some sort of, discrimination against a white person because, again, you're not going to go take away people's rights for hundreds of years, colonize their countries and lands, destroy their histories, make them learn different languages, completely indoctrinate them with new religions, and kind of like force them through a system of chattel slavery for hundreds of years. It's just not the same, right? Like, let's say you're in a situation where you're the one white person and people are, giving you crap because you're that one white person. When you leave that situation, you no longer face that prejudice. That's why it's not racism, right? Anyway, so that often gets kind of convoluted, especially on the internet these days. People can't really tell the difference because people get really emotionally involved in these things, but they do have definitions. That's what social science is all about. We can try and understand people, but we got to still be somewhat systematic about it. And words have meanings. So as racism is rooted in society's social structure, that's where we get the issue of systematic racism, right? The racism that was built into the fabric of the dominant institutions in our society. So, for example, the criminal justice system, right? I teach criminology, and we talk about how a lot of the early founding ideologies had a lot to do with eugenics and theories of inferiority and criminality based on racial prejudice, right? So when you understand that racism has a systemic issue, that it's built into these institutions, it means that even if people themselves are not individually racist, right, they can still benefit from a system that's organized to benefit some people at the expense of others. And this is what we kind of really talk about with the issue of privilege, is that, even if you say, oh, well, I don't see color or things like that because of your privilege, you're still benefiting from a system that's organized to put some people over others, instead of using your privilege to call those things out and to dismantle them, right? Instead, you're benefiting from that system, right? So this is often why people have a hard time seeing their own privilege or seeing their own positions that have some sort of power in these unequal systems, because of that idea that they don't want to think that they've benefited from something, especially something that bad, right? So people try to, especially this colorblind ideology, they try to find this way to make it not about race, right? It's this newer form of racism, though we've kind of hit the rewind button on colorblind racism, because colorblind racism was something that was very popular early 2000s, right? We were talking about that a lot in the scholarship, and then something happened around 2015 or so. Some guy rode down an escalator and said that Mexicans are rapists, and that he was running for president. And it kind of lifted up this huge rock of racism that was always there, but now had been given a platform and a voice. So it's interesting, a lot of my younger students thought, oh my God, racism, where'd it come from? It came back. It's like, no, it never left. It was just often coached in dog whistle terminology. Something we'll talk about later when we talk about politics, the way that we try to hide racism nowadays, but it's still like the intent is racism, right? So colorblind racism is a big part of this, or at least that ideology that kind of hides it, right? It's where dominant groups assume that race no longer matters. Even when society is highly racially segregated, and even when individual and group well-being is still strongly determined by race, many believe that being non-racist means being colorblind, meaning refusing to recognize or treat race as a significant factor. But ignoring the significance of race is to deny the reality of historical and modern racial oppression. And really, it's not going to change anything, right? It's just basically you benefiting from a system where you pat yourself on the back and say, yeah, well, I'm not racist, so therefore. But at this point, we have to understand that, You need to go beyond not being overtly racist and just coasting on privilege and actually be non-racist, something we'll talk about a little bit later. So that whole I don't see race, right? It just means you don't see the importance of race in modern society or understand the long history and legacy of racial relations in this country, right? And structuring expectations and opportunities differently for different groups and ethnicities over generations, right? How do you not see that? It's plain as day, right? And of course, racial formation, you're going to read the brief article of this in your book as well, but just to go over it a little bit. So a lot of people assume race is a fixed biological category, but the meaning and significance of race stems from specific social, historical, and those political contexts, right? So Omi and Winant developed an understanding of these changing processes, and they called this racial formation, right? Which shows how societies construct rules and practices that define groups in racial terms. So racial meanings constantly change as institutions evolve and as different groups contest those prevailing racial definitions that existed. So one example of this is the changing of race in the U.S. Census. So there's always been a large number of multiracial groups, and there's always been increasing diversity, right, over time as more immigrants became Americans, as laws got rid of miscegenation laws, things like that. So in 1860, only 3 races were charted: whites, blacks, and mulattoes. And of course, it's expanded and shrinked in categories and changed so many times since then when it comes to the census and what you write down as your race, the little boxes you check. So this is just one example of how the meanings and understandings around race change as a society changes. Okay, so social class. Class has a strong influence in American culture. It's a hierarchy that's attached to worth, not just monetary worth, but social worth. So social class shapes our life chances in America, even though the cultural narrative emphasizes social mobility and meritocracy. These distinctions are actually getting worse, not better. And again, just side note, social mobility, right? The ability to move up and down social class in your lifetime, meritocracy being the assumption that people that have things like billions of dollars got it because they worked the hardest, right? Which again, that's a whole nother thing we'll unpack later. So power. Power is the ability to influence and dominate others, not just interpersonally, but also in structural power that some groups have because of their position in a racialized and gendered class system that's fundamental to the system of capitalism. Meaning, privilege in social class encompasses both a position of material advantage and the ability to control and influence others. Not to mention the fact that poverty and gender and race are intricately connected when it comes to those kind of worth notions in the culture, right? So again, just to distinguish a little bit between income and wealth, income is the amount of money that's brought into a household in one year. So household income often comes from the income of individual workers. So many households need more than one earner to reach median levels of income, meaning, 2 people working, right, to support a household. So some workers also have to hold multiple jobs to make ends meet, right? Like yours truly, that's currently working 3 jobs, but often with a 4th. So that's fun, right? And then wealth, that's determined by adding up all of one's financial assets and subtracting all of your debt. So income and wealth are related, but they're not the same thing, right? While income is unequal and stratified by race, class, and gender, wealth is even more unequal. 1% of the population has more than the other 98% combined. So for most Americans, it's debt that's the reality, not wealth, right? And so wealth is like everything you own combined together. So, those homes, those cars. Like I remember actually when McCain was running against Obama, I was doing research on politics that year, and I remember they asked John McCain a question that shouldn't have stumped him, but it did. But it really just shows how wealthy he was and out of touch. Was they asked him, how many homes do you own? And he didn't know the answer. He was like, I'll have to get back to you on that. So for me, I'm like, I know the answer to that. If someone says, how many homes do you own? I say 0, right? Straightforward. So it's interesting to see how how wealthy one has to be to have so many homes that you're not even sure how many you have anymore, right? So wealth is cumulative, right? It adds to itself. So it's that kind of thing where if you don't have enough money in your bank account and you overdraft, they charge you like 30 to 60 bucks because you didn't have $1 in your bank account, right? But if you have like $100,000 sitting in your savings account, they give you hundreds of dollars every month just for the luxury of you having a bunch of money sitting there. So it's an interesting thing. Even the banking system itself is affected by who has power and who doesn't, meaning the banks screw you if you're poor and make a lot of money off of those overdraft fees, right? That they just then pump into the bank accounts of the wealthy people that already have so much damn money. So it's interesting, right? Interesting system. So when it comes to wealth as well, there's vast differences in the wealth holdings among different racial and ethnic groups. So the median net worth of white households is more than 10 times that of African American and Latino families. So even when there are economic downturns, like what happened in the recession in 2007 to 2008, people of color lose their jobs and homes at disproportionately higher rates than whites. So that has to do with something more than just, oh, people happen to be caught into this recession. It's like, well, these unequal structures reveal themselves even more in times of stress and strain, like such as a global pandemic, right? Something of that nature. All of those systems that are already failing, you put more stress on that system, it breaks down, right? So again, wealth is a cumulative disadvantage. For the people that have wealth, they have a cumulative advantage, right? Your wealth produces more wealth. People inherit money for their families, like sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. They just are born and they just get a full bank account, a fund to kind of just do whatever, right? i.e. Paris Hilton. And it's interesting because you have to think about how the whole system is structured for that advantage, right? So, for example, paying for college. We're the only developed nation of our kind that does not have some sort of free, affordable higher education for our citizens, right? So who does that benefit? Like, we know who doesn't benefit from that. I didn't benefit from it. I had to take out loans, right? I've had financial aid, thank God, right? Things like that. So who benefits from a system where you have to pay a lot of money to get through it? People that have a bunch of money, right? We always focus on who suffers, but we often don't look at how the systems itself privilege those people, and that's why they are the systems that we have, right? Like, what's her face paid for her kid to get into school and she got like 2 months in jail, right? I mean, we're talking about fraud. And again, a lot of times those kind of things get a slap on the wrist, while a person in possession of a small amount of marijuana can languish in jail for years, right? So race, class, gender, all of these things have a lot to do with our value systems, and really who we are in that hierarchy affects the way that our outcomes, the way we're treated, right? So in our culture, wealth handles healthcare, childcare, education, down payments on properties, right? Oh man, that's so sad. Just this whole thread I saw on Twitter the other day about someone talking about how when they went to, trying to figure out how to buy a home, they were asked, oh, well, how much is your family going to kick in? And they were like, what? And they're like, oh, well, it's normative that most first-time home buyers get a down payment from their families. And that kind of blew my mind, because as much as my family is as loving and caring as any other family, they don't have, like, here's $50,000+ to put down on a house. Like, it's just not a thing that someone's going to hand you. And that's a lot of families' realities, is you can't just, there's not just some 50 grand sitting there to be like, oh, boom, here you go. Now you have a down payment. But for people that have that wealth, it's not even a second thought. And so that produces this reality where things aren't really problems, right? So like you have Betsy DeVos, the billionaire, who never used financial aid but is in charge of, education, and yet basically is in charge of student loans and all of these programs, and yet doesn't understand what it's like to have to scrimp and save to work through college but still need loans, right? So it's interesting. Wealth creates this power in the culture that's not just about the money, it's about everything you can do with it. Like if you have a financial emergency, you're fine, right? Your Malibu mansion burns down, you're fine, right? If they're laid off, they can handle it, right? it's this ability to weather economic storms and problems that when over 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, only have less than $500 in their savings, then what happens when there's an economic downturn, which there is, right? What happens is people suffer, and the people that have the most marginality suffer the most, suffer the hardest, right? So this inequality, this wealth inequality in the US, when we look at income and wealth, you can see how poverty intersects with race and gender, right? And we'll talk about other identities as well later on. So the book points out how disturbing these differences are when we look at children, right? 20% of which live under the federal poverty line. So we can't really overstate the importance of social class when it comes to a capitalistic society, especially one that doesn't provide the kind of resources that are provided in other countries, like, again, subsidized childcare, subsidized, healthcare, right? If you never had to pay for higher education, for healthcare, for childcare, or had to pay low-cost versions of those things, yeah, I think you'd be okay with a few more taxes. But the idea is even our tax-based system now, the wealthy pay so little and they're able to wiggle out of it, that since we stopped taxing the wealthy over 70% in the 1970s, since then, we've had these economic downturns over and over. We've had these problems of how do we pay for our outrageous spending, right? While at the same time, we have no problem finding hundreds of billions more dollars per year for the military. Another thing we'll talk about later. All right, moving on. Okay, gender. So gender, like race, is socially constructed. Gender is rooted in social institutions and results in patterns within society that structure the relationships between women, men, people that are non-binary, and give them different positions of advantage or disadvantage within each institution. So the term gendered institution is used to define the total patterns of gender relations that are present in the processes, practices, images, and ideologies, and the distributions of power in various sectors of social life. End quote. That's basically the quote from your book. So this framework focuses the analysis of gender on relations and economic, political subordination, not just the interpersonal relations, but how those structures like the economy, having less access to jobs, having lower paid positions, right? The access in politics. I mean, the fact that it's been, 100 years in 2020 since women were allowed to vote, right? Or, try and hold political office. And again, that really only meant white women when it happened in 1920, because there was still so many laws, especially in the Jim Crow South, that virtually eliminated voting for people of color. So, when we talk about a gendered institution, it's really just seeing how the institutions themselves have to be changed. It's not just about changing people and their opinions about gender. That's a whole other thing. And yeah, for sure, that's a good thing too. But that's not going to change the institutions themselves because they already have these ideologies built into them, right? So this is where that gender through the prism of difference comes in. So gender is not a monolithic category, right? So if you say, oh, all women this, all men that, you can't, because none of those are monolithic categories, right? Gender is constructed differently depending on the specific social locations of diverse groups of people. So this idea that you can say, oh, there's some commonality of experience between all women. There might be some commonality of experience between some women or some men, but men are going to experience the world differently based on their race and their class and their sexuality and these other identities, right? Just as women, just as any group, just as non-binary or trans people, just as anyone, right? You're going to interact with these things differently depending on all those intersections. So this notion of, oh, all men this, all women that, it's just, there are no monolithic categories. But that's the problem for people if they don't want to think critically. They just want a monolithic category. They want to say you're this or you're that, the end, because then they don't have to think. And for me, I'm just so grateful that that is not reality, because that would be crazy boring, right? Reality is so much more complex and interesting. So this idea of prisms is understanding how the differences in our social locations equate to differences in social and economic experiences, right? Something we'll talk about later. So when race, class, and gender come together with sexuality, they construct stereotypes. So each gain meaning in relationship to one another. Our media likes to construct controlling images of men and women in the pop culture, especially that are racialized and sexualized. So in the media, race, gender, sexual stereotypes, they all intertwine in different ways. So there's stereotypes of African American men that claim that they're hypersexual and violent, while stereotypes of African American women see them as promiscuous or bad mothers, or they use these long-held cultural narratives that have been basically in place since, either slavery or Reconstruction era, like the mammy archetypes, or the Jezebel, the Sapphire, to try to control Black women's behavior, right? And these stereotypes become solidified in the culture. But the racist ideology, right, the fear of Black men raping white women, that was a major argument that the Klan tried to use to justify their lynching and terror and terrorism of so many African Americans. Like, that wasn't very long ago, right? But that's the ideology that we forget about. And these stereotypes make their mark and they stay, right? But we forget about what put them there in the first place. So when you look at the sexual stereotypes for Black women, they differ from white women, who are characterized as either sluts or virgins, the classic Madonna whore complex, right? A similar logic is given to Latinas, but when you're looking at whites, you can see how class structures difference, meaning rich women are considered sexually uptight, while working class white women are assumed to be sexually promiscuous. So that's just kind of one way we can see how they intersect, right? So we can see how controlling images of sexuality are really part of the architecture of race, class, and gender oppression. It shows how these things interact together to create our experiences. Okay, so ethnicity and migration. So immigration has a huge impact on the composition of America and really often the cultural value systems. So, immigration has always been an interesting topic within American society because oftentimes the history of immigration is America's happy to have you when you can help out with cheap labor, and then once you're done, we want you gone, right? There's often vilifying and stereotypes and a lot of stuff that we've seen in the past that we see the exact same things today, right? What's interesting nowadays, though, too, is the ways in which ethnicity has become almost a targeting sensor for immigration, right? Meaning we assume we can see if a person's an immigrant, right? There's kind of an assumption that someone is Latinx as an immigrant, though a lot of people that are here undocumented did this thing where they just flew in a plane to America and had a visa at some point and then just didn't go home, right? There's a lot of people here that went to school and then just never went back. And this kind of racist vitriol against the entire Latino community based on some false assumptions about undocumented people being somehow dangerous or criminal. These things are whipped up in a fervor in the modern political era. It's just a dog whistle. Really, it's just a way to get people that are scared and frightened to vote for someone, right? Even though it's not based in logic or reality, right? Undocumented Americans actually have some of the lowest offending rates of any group. Why? Because they don't want to get caught in any way, right? They're not going to do something stupid to risk, being deported and being separated from their family. So this kind of assumptive nature, like in the SB 1070 show me your papers laws in Arizona, this idea that you can look at someone and say, well, I stopped you because you look like an immigrant, right? That just means that larger communities get targeted and profiled and policed. Un-American in the sense that America is supposed to be a land of freedom and equality and liberty, and not a place where people are targeted because of who they are. That's kind of like the whole jam of America was supposed to be like, hey, freedom, you be you, I'll be me. But that is not actually what it is, right? And so this has been further complicated through globalization as immigrant labor used to do a lot of jobs within the United States. Now a lot of labor is just being offshored or outsourced to other countries. Right? So globalization has also affected the racial composition of America, but it's mostly affected the way that income and wealth inequality have intensified in the modern era, largely because of deindustrialization, right? Meaning there used to be factories where people could make a decent living, and those things went away, nothing came to replace it, except for the underground economy of drugs and guns. And as a result, you have these areas that are economically depressed because they, a couple generations ago, used to actually support almost a middle-class lifestyle. But those jobs go away because if they have to pay someone $30 an hour here, but then they can pay someone in a sweat shop, $2 an hour somewhere else, it's just the sense of capitalism. They're going to try to look for the largest investment for their dollar. So who cares if it's workers? Who cares if it's their livelihood? Who cares if it destroys entire communities as long as the company makes more money, right? So that's kind of the issue with globalization. Obviously, globalization has brought us a lot of things like, communication, technology, all sorts of stuff that we take for granted that make life so much better, right? Living nowadays. But globalization has an extremely dark downside, especially the fact that what we don't see, it's like out of sight, out of mind. We forget that all of our stuff is being manufactured in places that have terrible working conditions. People are being maltreated and often targeted because of those marginalities that they may have. So we'll continue to talk about globalization when we talk about the economy. But it's just important to understand the way that this is kind of restructured how jobs work and really what opportunities are available to a lot of people, right? It hit the marginalized communities first, but now it's rippled out into the rest of society and it's hitting the entire middle class, right? All right, real quick, symbolic ethnicity. A lot of people use social narratives to see ethnic and racial inequality as a failure of people to assimilate, right? Oh, you're not mainstream enough. You're not trying to be white, basically, right? All these white ethnic groups have done it, so why isn't everyone else? So Mary Waters argues that this gives whites in America symbolic ethnicity, meaning their ethnic identity doesn't influence their lives unless they want it to, right? So you say, oh, like, I'm Italian, right? That doesn't mean that people are now going to treat me differently, right? Or not in the way that the kind of slurs that existed that my grandmother, who was an immigrant, heard as an Italian immigrant, are not the kind. They just aren't there for my generation, right? So it's not something that I can bring it up and it's not going to at all harm me, right? Or I remember once, terrible job. I mean, I should have never taken that job, but I needed a job really bad, as one does, and it was actually like my third job at the time. This terrible lighting place, like literally they sold like light bulbs and crap like that, like sconces. And this lady, she had like 1 million crucifixes everywhere. So I casually brought up that I went to Catholic school, even though I'm an avowed atheist at this point, somewhat because of the Catholic school, somewhat because of other things. But anyway, and so I just kind of like brought up the symbolic ethnicity of Catholicism because I knew it would make her like me. I knew it would engender her to me. But it's not something that like I have to volunteer these things for people to know them, right? It's not something like my skin tone that can just be read immediately and people can judge me then based on that immediately, right? It's something that you can use when you want to, like Mary Waters is saying, in a way that doesn't influence your life unless you want it to. Okay, so the linkage between race, class, and gender is really revealed within studies of sexuality. Because sexuality is really a dimension of each. So sexuality operates as a system of power and inequality that's comparable to, and of course intersecting, those other systems of race, class, and gender. So first up here is homophobia. This is just the fear or hatred of homosexuality, something that's very prevalent in the culture and really is still being used as a defense when people are tried for killing trans people. It's horrific. And heterosexism is the institutionalized power and privilege that's accorded to heterosexual behavior and identification. So if only heterosexuality is labeled as normal, then LGBTQ folks become deviant in comparison just by default. So homophobia also affects heterosexuals. It's really a huge part of the gender ideology, especially for men, when they're young adults. It's used to distinguish normal, quote unquote, normal men, right? Those social norms, and women from people that are considered deviant, right? So men are often called homophobic or sexist slurs in order to police their performance of masculinity, right? Like C.J. Pascoe's work, the book, the ethnographic book, Dude, You're a Fag, where she talks to these male students about the way that they police each other's gender performance using homophobic slurs, right? So the idea is if you call a man a girl, if you call a man a homosexual, it's invoking the hierarchy, right, of society to say, oh, well, women are considered beneath men. So if you're saying, oh, you play ball like a girl or something like that, which is, so much in the sports culture, right? Which again, let's look at the sports culture. Why were women not as good at sports? And I say were because, like, let's look at the Olympics and Serena. Like, women are definitely as good at sports as men now, right? So why weren't women? Because they were legally restricted from playing sports for many years, from having professional leagues, that the Title IX didn't happen until the 1970s. So yeah, like women were literally barred from running the marathon until a woman snuck in and ran the marathon. And then 50 years later, that same marathon, a woman won. So anyway, this idea of, you can exclude people and be like if you basically take let's say one group of people in society, like everyone that's left-handed, and just don't teach them to read, you can be like, hey, look, all those left-handed people can't read, right? Because you made it that way. But anyway, so these ideas of deviance, of normalcy, is so constructed on this traditional gender norms from generations past, from those meanings past, those histories past, right? But sexuality, like all the others, is a social construction. It does change, but it's often used in such a stark way to try to police us because it's something that we're kind of afraid of, right? It's something that we're really affected by, right? It seems very internalized to us. So when it comes to discrimination, while there have been some strides in recent years, right, such as same-sex marriage laws, things like that, just a recent Supreme Court case that finally protected people from being fired because they're gay or trans, there's still a lot of active discrimination that happens. There's still a lot of laws that are popping up in states all over the country trying to specifically target either homosexuals, lesbians, or, people that are considered transgender, or just really non-binary, by forcing these bathroom bills and other kind of legislation to try to police and enforce gender as a specific set of standards that, again, is really the dying vestiges of a dinosaur society trying to hold on to a outmoded, archaic power system of gender. Gender's not what people thought it was 50 years ago because it's not 50 years ago, right? So these things change. And when it comes to sexuality, our understandings and notions of sexuality are also changing quite a bit in modern years, mostly because nowadays we have more ways to kind of communicate outside of just status quo networking, right? So having social media, right? Having these kind of technological places where people can meet up, have collective senses of community that don't have to be located in a place and time, right? Versus the way that, in the kind of Stonewall uprising, the way that the physicality, the place of the Stonewall bar had everything to do with building that community. Nowadays, we have online communities. We have ways to build past just the physical location aspects. So there are definitely ways that things are getting better, but it can always backslide. It can always change in a day. It's the fact that there's still so much widely accepted stereotypes, hate, discrimination, stigma, and really just the alarmingly high amount of deaths of people in the LGBTQ community just because of that identity, that are targeted, victimized, beaten, killed because of their identities, right? So clearly there's still a lot of work to be done to try to create an equitable society where people can actually have freedom, exist, and not have to live in fear, right? Where holding the hand of the person that you love while walking down the street is not something that you second guess doing because you're worried about your safety, right? So this is something that obviously we'll talk about throughout the class, It has been encouraging the progress that has been made, but obviously there's still a long, long road ahead.